Hello and welcome everybody to our session today. The session that you've joined is focused on visitor experience planning, and as you will have seen from the blurb, we're going to be sharing some examples with you of our approach to essentially master planning, but with a strongly visitor focus in mind. My name is Oriel Wilson. I am part of the interpretation and new business teams at Hayley Sharp, so very much involved in the front end of projects.
And my name is Paul Cagle. I'm a 3D designer for Hayley Sharp, and this obviously involves working with the client to assess their requirements on projects, and then creating a design concept, following that through to technical and completion of the project.
It's great to have everybody with us today. Conscious that some of you will have heard of Hayley Sharp before, others may not. We are an integrated heritage planning, interpretation and experience and exhibition design agency. We're based in the heart of Leicester in the UK, in the Midlands. We work throughout the UK, North America and the Middle East. And today we're going to be sharing with you a number of examples from our portfolio of this visitor experience planning process. It is worth saying before we get started, there is obviously the opportunity to ask some questions depending on what you've heard or anything you'd like extra information about. You can use the question function as part of the webinar. If you type your questions in, we will give our presentation first, but we're obviously happy to answer questions as best we can at the end of the session. So please do think of anything that you would like to ask us. So at its core, visitor experience planning is very much an audience-centred approach, essentially to master planning and site revitalisation. It's very much about focusing on audience engagement, and we believe that by doing that, it helps to create sustainable and resilient attractions for the long term. As I mentioned, we're going to share two client case studies with you this afternoon. The first of which is from the ABMC, the American Battle Monuments Commission, and Paul is going to just give you an insight into that client and the projects that we have been working on. Sorry, I have missed a slide out already. So I just want to start by giving a quick overview to some of the current trends that we have witnessed in visitor experience planning, which really has informed our session today. As many of you will be aware, there is a real emphasis in many countries on both regional and national tourism strategies. One of the case studies that we're going to be sharing with you today is actually from the Republic of Ireland, and we've done a lot of work in the last couple of years, particularly building on Fulcher Island, funding body there, their focus on regional strategies, Ireland's Ancient East, Hidden Heartlands, World Atlantic Way, which have very successfully put forward regional structures for tourism development so that individual product and site developments can happen not in a vacuum, actually as part of an integrated tourism process. One of the trends we've really witnessed, and we think this is a very positive thing, is the move away from sort of hard infrastructure-focused master plans. In the past, very often, by the time that a company like Hayley Sharp will be brought on board, some of the larger project parameters, such as buildings, transport, environmental infrastructure, have been set. But actually, increasingly, there's a move towards integrating both infrastructure and interpretive needs, right to thinking about those things together right from the outset of the project, the very early planning stages of the scheme. And that is really playing out in quite practical means. And one of the things that we will draw out as part of this session is some tips and hints of ways in which you can apply some of these trends and outputs to projects you might be working on. And actually, one of the things that has really emerged in recent years is the primacy of creating a quality visitor experience and really using that factor as the driving factor in early master planning projects. And actually, interestingly, as interpretive designers, whereas in the past we may have just been part of a master planning team, increasingly we are effectively being put in the driving seat. We are leading master planning processes with that visitor and audience focus very much in mind. So I will hand over now to Paul, who is going to introduce our first case study. Paul.
Okay, so yeah, the American Battle Monuments Commission, they maintain and oversee a large number of military memorials around the world, and these are often cemeteries or monuments, which are accompanied by additional visitor centres, wayfinding signage, and often need to be redesigned, maintained, updated, or designed from scratch, which is where our work comes in. And overall, this is really how we would approach a visitor experience that involves quite emotive aspects and sensitive landscapes, and that's why these projects are quite interesting, really. We've been fortunate to work with the ABMC on several projects, actually, and they retain some. They're all unique, but they do retain some consistencies as well. I suppose the biggest one of those is that they're all places of remembrance and respect. And in some ways, that's as designers, that's great for us, because we we can create those powerful and emotive moments, which is great for us. But also we'll have to bear in mind that they are sometimes somber experiences for people as well. And for example, the methods we use to engage with school children on school trips is going to be very different from how we would engage with a family that's there to see a loved one, for example. So really, it's about that the work we do with them is always need to be very balanced and always complement that bigger picture. The other interesting point on the projects we're about to look at is that a lot of them are World War II sites, and the ABMC are in an interesting position at the minute, where really the events and the subject matter is falling out of living memory, and it's really interesting because they now have to adapt and evolve to those new audiences, and that for us really is where the challenge lies, and it's how we keep it respectful but also engage that next generation of visitor.
Great, thanks, Paul. So one of the sites that we were called in to look at is Point Dock. Now that is the site, actually very high promontory that sits between Omaha and Utah beaches as part of the D-Day landing, really pivotal location, and the site of a really quite heroic scaling by American forces of the quite sheer cliffs on the 6th of June, D-Day in 1944. Now, interestingly, slightly contradicting what I said at the start, this was a commission where we weren't leading, but we were working very closely with an architectural team to carry out a holistic review of the visitor experience as a whole, to look at the management of the site, and particularly to put forward a revised vision for the presentation across the site. Now, as you'll see from some of the photos that we've got on screen at the moment, the landscape that visitors encounter today is actually still, very much marked by those events during the Second World War. There are bomb craters and the remains of historic structures that were used as defensive positions. But because of the state of the pathways and some of the infrastructure on the site, it's very unclear for visitors actually how they are supposed to traverse that landscape, and particularly which parts of the sites are really part of the memorial, and therefore need to be treated with respect. So a particular focus of our project was very much about engendering a new respect for the landscape, and as Paul has mentioned, giving visitors, many of whom have no direct links or contact to the site, an understanding of the events and narratives that occurred there. Part of the approach, again going back to this idea of interpretive planning and visitor experience planning really underpinning a master planning process, even before we started looking at the site with the architects, we started straight up with an overarching interpretive framework. We wanted to enable the client to take a step back and really start to think about how visitors might conceptually understand what they see in front of them. What might the interpretation and the visitor experience cover and involve? So as you can see from the diagram we've got on screen, this was an example of an early diagram that we put in place to discuss with the client. And it was really thinking about how visitors might encounter the story. So it's putting in mind this idea of being there. What would it have been like to journey across that landscape in 1944? What does the landscape and the historic structures that you see today, how do they fit into that story? It's giving people a direct encounter with the voices of the past, the people, the troops who were fighting there, local communities who they then later came across, and people who were involved in the conflict in many different ways. And really importantly, for particularly for the ABMC, is putting in place perhaps a new way for these sites to start to give people the opportunity to take a step back, to have more of a reflective experience in terms of perhaps thinking about the legacy of the events and sacrifices that were made on site. So this very high-level conceptual approach was taken really before any of the site dynamics themselves were examined. However, we did obviously need to move on and look at that. And so that framework was put and overlaid into the site itself. And I think the two things that I would want to highlight from this diagram is very much that it's holding in tension together both some of the operational and functional aspects of a site that need to be considered, but doing that with those interpretive and messaging priorities on the table right from the start. And particularly, as I mentioned earlier, giving people an understanding of the significance of the site that they're looking at, and therefore making it very clear through, for example, these respect thresholds that you can see marked A and B in green, where that site experience really starts. We explored that through a number of physical interventions that will be put onto the landscape. So that's point to walk. Paul is now going to share some examples of a similar process that we took at the Normandy cemetery.
Yep, so this was a project that we undertook to redevelop the exhibition within the Visit Centre at the Normandy American Cemetery. So a little bit more focused than Point de Hoc, but a similar area and similar type of visitor as well. And the cemetery itself is situated on Omaha Beach, which is one of the sites of D-Day landing. It's an amazing site and really poignant, and it's a resting place for over 9,000 American soldiers who died on that day or in the following battles. So a huge place of significance for many, and as I said, many of those will be family members who are visiting for the first time and seeing the resting place, and also the place they fought and died. And the site itself gets over 1 million visitors a year, and for us in particular, it was a fast track project because it was designed and created and installed within a year, and that was to coincide with the 75th anniversary of D-Day in 2019. So in regards to the visitor experience planning, as you can see, this is a huge site, which is quite impactful as it is, and the visitor centre itself is quite a small part of the journey in comparison. So the other thing is visitors can take any route they like around the area. It doesn't feel quite right to have a guided route, and they're going to see different things. So the visitor routes, the amount of time they're there, and what they're there for can vary quite dramatically. So to think about the experience planning, the first point for us really was to analyze those visitors. And this particular project is quite challenging as well, because it's also not appropriate to go around and question people all the time. You have to choose your time. So we were quite careful to study the visitors carefully and respectfully, but also see how that experience was before we went in. And the other thing we were able to do on this particular project is speak a lot with the staff, and that's something we'd always try and do where we can on any project, is to really speak to the staff all the way from the welcome desk teams to the maintenance people. And interestingly, most of them are from the area, so they have great stories about relatives that lived in Normandy, for example, under occupation. So we're always pleasantly surprised, and in particular on this project, surprised by the stories we got from them and the sort of passion they spoke with about it. So really that helped us a lot. The second thing we need to understand on this project, and that again really helped us, was that the work we were doing here, no matter how good a job we do, it's never going to be as emotive as the landscape outside, or that moment when the visitor walks amongst the 9,000 headstones. So I think when it's on that kind of scale, in any project that's on that kind of scale, it's great to sort of step back and start with that overall perspective, and not to immediately drill down into the design details, which is always really really quite tempting from a designer's point of view. And hopefully it doesn't overshadow that experience. I think the better we can equip visitors with the story instead, and then let them explore, it becomes a more powerful experience for them, and probably one that lasts longer with them as well, that they leave with. So another key feature of the visitor centre for the visitor is that they keep seeing links between the landscape and the interior. So like I said, our job was largely in the interior of that visitor centre, but one of the constant themes was to keep referring to that landscape. One, because the story of D-Day is so linked to it. If you think about the beaches and what the guys did on D-Day, and then the following battles as well, that the landscape, not only did it happen there, but it also played such a huge part in the process. So we always wanted to keep those links. So for example, that in this case, to give you a bit of a design insight, that was even down to small things like using graphics and text that and materials that were quite weathered, and then you see the use of sort of steel that it has quite a watery effect. So kind of subtle elements like that helped us to keep reconnecting those things as a visitor pass through. And then the other thing with this one is orientation as well. So that the reason you'll see that floor map that's on the screen now in front of that reflection pool, as they call it, is that the orientation here is so powerful because it happened here, and that's the key message that kept trying to get through as well, is that sense of place. So it's just examples of how we can use small things inside and in the space we have to still link to and connect with that wider visitor experience. And lastly on that, I think one thing I always think it's interesting to do is think about the experience as a whole, but really it's those specific moments as well, those way we try and move people. And I think on this project we were able to do that by having these examples where the visitor looks out to the sea, but if they're equipped with the story and the fact that they know they're standing on the spot where it happened, it becomes magnified and all the more powerful, I think. And lastly, on Normandy, there were areas as part of the experience that were below ground, where we have that visual separation. So how does that work within the experience? Well, firstly, it works in the way that it does give us a suitable space to convey the reality of war, which we really wanted to do, to come back to that point about engaging with younger audiences and giving them the cold, hard truth about what happened on those beaches. But also we wanted to draw back to the landscape, and as you can see here, this particular example is using a replica of a beach obstacle, which were used by the Nazis to destroy the boats of the Allies, and we combine that with an image of the beach. So again, we're linking to part of the experience where the visitors are going to go out to the beaches after. So we tried to sort of create links like that as well. And finally, the other thing we did was use a lot of imagery. We were looking in a way that there's a lot of imagery associated with World War II that's really powerful and that we can use. But also what we tried to do was use a lot of imagery that focused on French life under occupation, which was a big theme we were asked to explore anyway. And the other effect of that is that for the visitor, to get to this location, they have to pass through a lot of the French villages and areas where this happened. So being able to show that real life but under occupation was really useful to us. And we found it ourselves when we were going back and forth to the site, that you then go through those places and see them in a different light, and try and put yourself in the shoes of the people who live there. But all those things and that overall planning really helped us, when it came to setting out the design of the exhibition.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that's a really key point, isn't it? That actually our approach is very much not just thinking about the individual specifics of a site or project in isolation. It's thinking about the way in which visitors will approach a site and their experience getting there, and from both a physical and practical point of view, but from an interpretive perspective as well. And that's certainly been the case for the project that we're currently working with, County Clare Council in Ireland, which is the Cliffs of Moher. Really stunning natural landscape site. We seem to have a theme of cliffs in this presentation today. Some of you may well have visited the site. The Cliffs of Moher stretch for some 8 kilometres along the Atlantic coast of Clare, County Clare in Ireland. And they're visited, they're hugely popular already as an attraction, visited by well over 1 million people per year, obviously pre-COVID, but different this year. But even still, actually internal visitors within Ireland, there's been quite a high level of visitation this year as well. And people come to the site for lots of different reasons. Obviously, the stunning scenery, the photo opportunities, but also the wildlife and the fact that the site is part of the UNESCO Burren and Cliffs Geopark, so a site that's important on many levels. And the vast majority of visitors, even though many come, and it is an elongated site along the coast, nonetheless, the vast majority of visitors do come through a visitor centre that was established in the 2000s on the outskirts of Liscannor. And actually, whilst it was an award-winning visitor centre in its time, it quite quickly has become, to be honest, swamped by the number of people that are coming to visit the site. And that is having a very negative effect, particularly on people's experience, but also on the actual infrastructure and, of course, the environmental parameters of the site as well. So we are currently working with the client to create a really significant master plan. But what's interesting about it is not just, again, a sort of infrastructure-based master plan. It's very much a visitor experience strategy, a long-range, long-view strategy running up to 2040. So yes, absolutely, it covers a lot of different disciplines. It includes environmental planning with the CEA process, transport assessment, particularly thinking of off-site, transport hubs, looking at different parking and arrival options, sustainable transport. We're considering different landscape approaches, both in terms of interpretive devices and the treatment of pathways and land ownership. We're looking at economic context, and obviously a key aspiration for the site is to actually encourage more visitors. And actually, you can see on the slide before, the site sits as part of one of these brand identities, the Wild Atlantic Way, that has been hugely successful in Ireland. Many people travel parts of that Wild Atlantic Way. It creates brilliant itineraries for you. The downside, and almost a sort of flip side of the success, is that actually some of those inland locations within the rest of the county of Clare, for example, people aren't visiting as much because they are just sticking to that Wild Atlantic Way. And so actually trying to encourage economic growth as a basis for tourism, drawing upon the large number of visitors that already go to the site is a key part of the work. And there are many other consultants involved as well. But what's really significant is back to this point that actually the project isn't being run through the lens of transport or environment or even landscape, but is actually being run through the eyes of the visitor. So we've done a lot of profiling of audiences to understand who's coming, who's not coming, what the needs of audiences are. Many different factors to that: practical, learning, social, economic, and really thinking about the experience and the experiences that would be possible to implement at the site. And really key to the approach, and something that we're keen to share with you today, and happy to sort of take further questions on this, is actually around the structure of the commission itself. And what has been interesting is the way in which the client, with ourselves, have actually managed the process. And so thinking about the objectives of the commission, i.e. this very wide view, this wide-ranging strategic view, is making sure that your commission structure, the way in which you commission services, actually helps you to achieve that goal. And so, for example, for the Cliffs of Moher, what we've done is we've created and worked within 3 packages, and these are running iteratively, so we are actually halfway through stage B at the moment. So the first stage of the project is that very wide view. It's thinking about the regional context, the way in which visitors approach the attraction at the moment, and how they interface and interact or not with the wider region. It then focuses down on the site itself, arrival and access and circulation around the site, and then and only then does it start to tease out requirements for physical interventions, interpretive interventions on the site. And this has been done very deliberately so that the Commission can dovetail with County Clare's wider tourism strategy that's actually about to be released, but is just subject to some reviews because of COVID planning, and also other tourism models, so the VICE model for sustainable tourism, and also the UN sustainability goals, particularly with factors such as well-being and local community input and benefits in mind. So, very conscious of time, so we're going to just bring together a few points out of the projects that we have shared with you. Really, these are quite practical tips, hopefully, about how, as clients, you can think about structuring really effective visitor-focused experience plans and master plans. We absolutely recognise that funders are very often seeking very specific and particular deliverables, whether that's the NLHF, in the UK, Fulshire Island, or others, ERDF, etc. But we really recommend that teams are creative with a structure of a commission. That might include things like who leads the commission, what services are given an emphasis in terms of scope, so that you can really adapt to the realities of an individual site, and particularly the audiences that you are looking to engage with. We also would really recommend people aren't afraid of seeking multidisciplinary teams. Now, we recognise that for clients, sometimes that's a bit alarming. You think, oh my goodness, there's going to be lots of people to deal with. But we would really recommend finding groups of consultants that are willing to work together, work collaboratively towards a united development vision. Very practically, we'd also recommend, and we haven't touched much on this, happy to answer questions around this, but leaving adequate time, sufficient time for dialogue and coordination, both within the team, particularly if you have multiple partners, but obviously with stakeholders and with communities. And that really leads us to our final point, that as we've tried to sort of convey today, it's very much about knowing the audience. We really recommend that before clients embark on projects like this, that you have a really firm understanding of your audience profiles, people that you would like to target as part of a particular development scheme. And if that information isn't in place at the start of the commission, prioritising the gathering of that information perhaps as part of a visitor experience planning process. And then as the process goes through, really being willing and committing time to testing and testing again, building a rapport with potential audiences and community groups to ensure that all the components that are being put forward, whether it's transport, people movement, environmental or interpretive and design devices, are truly meeting your defined visitor need. So they're just a few sort of learning points and things to consider from us. We'd be happy to take any questions you have. I see that there's already a question, Suprira, I think I'll read it out. It says, for point to op, which IP approach was ultimately chosen? That is a really good question. And I can actually say that in the end, elements of all 3 were chosen. And that is actually something that often happens, that it was recognised that different elements, different approaches, worked for different audience profiles that were coming to point to op, and then secondly, inevitably had a particular resonance to different parts of the site and different offers on the site. So where we're actually at with that project, the next stage is to move forward, applying the different aspects of that IP approach and those approaches to specific areas of the site, working with the architects, working with other consultants to really develop the proposals there. Great. Let's just see other questions. Yeah, so
sorry, Oriol, can I I mean, there was a comment also that I think was interesting about taking the visitor on. I'm not sure which project it was referring to specifically from that, but it was about taking the visit on a complete story, and I think it's a really good word for it, actually, and I think it speaks to the thing about the multidiscipline approach as well, and implementing that from the start, because it's so, I think quite rightly, and I think we pointed out in the presentation as well, it's very easy to jump into those specific details, and I think go to what you know and use your previous experience to jump into specifics, and like we said, I think stepping back and working with different teams, and I think for us as well, gaining knowledge from different teams, and the Cliffs of Moher is a great example of that. We're working with, you know, perhaps teams that we wouldn't otherwise work with, I think, or you probably agree. So just, yeah, getting that complete picture from the start is really useful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I'd pick up on that in terms of one of the disciplines I didn't list on the screen for that is actually brand and marketing. And again, that project and many of the projects that we've developed for Fawther Island and different clients in Ireland have that integrated branding and marketing development, again, included right from the outset, recognising that the visitor journey really needs to start from point of awareness, point of decision, all the way through to post-visit, follow-up on social media, different platforms, etc. So, yeah, that's a good point. Hi, Anna. I think you've asked a question about the VICE model for sustainable tourism. That is, they're actually the various, it's an acronym, obviously. You see different words used, but generally it stands for visitor, industry, communities and environment. So it's looking, and you can use that as a sort of model to assess proposals, to make sure you can give them different weightings, and then review and assess proposals based on the weightings that you've given them for any given, you know, project. And it's really a way to make sure that there is a balanced approach to obviously visitor experience development, taking into consideration often on sites like Cliffs of Moher, which is obviously environmentally very sensitive, all the way through to things like the ABMC type project, which is obviously sensitive from a subject matter and historical monument perspective, a commemorative site. And so by giving those different factors weightings, you can then assess the proposals in that way. Hopefully that helps.
I've got a question for you, Oriol, that I meant to ask earlier. I'm just going to ask it. I'm going to ask it on stage. Why has Ireland and the Cliffs in particular seen such a surge in those numbers then in such a quite a short space of time?
Well, I mean, the Cliffs of Moher has always been popular. I think it very much goes back, and this overlaps with the marketing sort of capacity as well. As I say, and as we sort of said at the beginning of the presentation, Ireland has been very, very successful in developing these brand identities. And if people are interested, I recommend looking up on Fawther Island's website, these brand identities for different areas of the country. So Ireland's Ancient East, there's one centred around Dublin as well, Hidden Heartlands for the centre of the country, and Wild Atlantic Way. And what those are essentially a toolkit that tourism providers more locally within those regions can use to tap into narratives, stories, types of experience to create these and build into these itineraries. They've been brilliant marketing tools for the country, and they really capture the spirit, I think, very effectively of Ireland's history, heritage, and sort of natural landscape. So, yeah, I think that's very much sort of what's driven. Ireland has seen sort of big upturns in tourism. Obviously, this year is very much an exception, but I think that has, you know, been a big part of their success.
Yeah.
Anna, interesting question. Yes, opportunities for people to donate. Paul, I don't know whether you want to say.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I mean, firstly, just so on the ABMC, and I know I'm slightly biased having worked with them, but I would encourage anyone to really look at the work they do. I think for us in this country as well, it's a really interesting insight to how we remember, war heroes. Or it's the level of detail and the pristine nature of these sites is unbelievable. It's the effort they've gone to for their heroes, as they see it, is incredible. And so the ABMC themselves, so yeah, worth looking into them anyway. But they're a government arm, so they can't fundraise as such. So what they have is another branch called the ABMF. I'm going to forget the exact.
It's foundation at the end of.
Yes, the American Battle Monuments Foundation. Yep. So we've actually worked with them a little bit to put some fundraising elements into the exhibitions, but it's always quite right. It's always a real balance for the ABMC because they, again, to come back to that thing, they're such poignant sites that it's a real balance to try and do something that's respectful and honourable and without saying give us your money, so they do get the balance really. They do it really well, I think. So, for example, at the end of the Normandy exhibition, there's a small screen where you can add your details. It's certainly not a money pot you could donate to or anything like that. It's find out more and see how you can help. But yeah, great question. So ABMF, American Battle Monuments Foundation, is the organisation that does that.
Great. Any other specific questions or comments? Be happy to take them. One area that we didn't particularly go into much detail about, but is obviously a really big part, and I mentioned it obviously at the end, is the process of stakeholder engagement and community consultation. And actually, as part of our methodology for these visitor experience plans, we always put in place a consultation plan, a sort of sub-plan, at the start of the commission, and usually that's developed obviously in conjunction with the client team. Sometimes clients want to be very hands-on with that, sometimes for various reasons they don't. And that identifies both stakeholders, community members, audience representatives, or audience groups that obviously it's important to consult with. And really importantly, and this is particularly relevant obviously now because of COVID, it's thinking about the most appropriate means to consult with those individuals, the ways in which will facilitate the best and most informative feedback, and in a way that is manageable for people, because we recognise people are often very busy when they're being asked to contribute comments. But also it's thinking about how realistically and being very honest with people about the parameters for being able to comment and add feedback. So it's making sure that the things that you are offering up for consultation, the decisions or the aspects of the scheme, are things that they can meaningfully comment on. They're not things that are already being decided and actually people will feel like they're offering their comments and not seeing change as part of that. So we do a lot of, we do obviously in-person consultation, we do use market research agencies, and actually we also do a lot now of obviously online surveys and digital sessions, often a bit like this, where we'll give a presentation, various people will be invited to a session, and then we'll facilitate a discussion. So really important that that is scheduled in sort of through the process. Another question brilliantly about target audiences. And I think, so the question is, do you often have to help clients think through their target audiences, or do they usually come to you with a fairly clear sense of that? I think the honest answer is absolutely both. So some clients will come with a very clear understanding. They'll have done perhaps pre-work to assess audiences, to think through who they are looking to target. But very often that isn't the case, or they might have a broad idea but really want to test that those assumptions as part of this visitor experience planning process. So again, something that we offer, we actually have an integrated business planning component to the work that we do. So part of that is helping clients, in some instances, to define those audiences, to understand what their priorities, interests, learning, social needs might be, but also helping the client from a purely economic perspective to really understand which components of their audience, perhaps from a financial sustainability perspective, are audiences that are, you know, really good audiences to grow. Perhaps they might have capacity for repeat visits, moving on to other sites in that organisation's portfolio, etc. Question about what can be implemented to change or broaden audiences. Again, great question. I think very site specific, very much depends on the parameters of the site, the story, collections, experience, etc. Again, I think this is where data comes into it. So knowing who your target audiences are, particularly if they are current visitors, but especially if they aren't people who are already visiting. So if there are groups that you are particularly wanting to engage with, it's really understanding what are the factors that are going to encourage those groups to come to be able to broaden your audience. I think a lot of that is about representation. It's making sure that people see that there is content, storylines, the way in which those storylines are presented are relevant to them. So in some instances, obviously, as exhibit designers, we think a lot about the media and the kind of experiences we are putting in place. But it is also, and this is my area of interest, the sort of content side of things, it's also about the messaging. It's about the breadth of the story that is being presented. So yeah, hopefully that helps, a bit of both, and also practical considerations. So again, why this sort of model of visitor experience planning, we believe, is an integrated approach is really important, because for lots of visitors, actually practical considerations, the arrival sequence, the availability of affordable cafes, retail that's offered in a sensible and, you know, not necessarily in your face always kind of way, is actually part of the mix as well. So all those practical and content and interpretive factors. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I was just going to add on that, Ori. I think the first, going back to the earlier question as well about the target audiences, I think it is very project specific, because well, to use the examples we've shown here, actually, like I said, the ABMC staff essentially they almost know their audience inside out. They know why people are coming, and also they're in a position actually where they get to meet a lot of them. It's their job to meet a family and show them some really interesting things they do there, actually. Again, just to go back to the of how well they do it. I'll keep this brief, but they not only do they welcome the family as such and treat them really well and show them their headstone, but there's little things like they take sand and from the D-Day beach and press that into the letters of the headstone. So when that family comes to see that headstone on the day that they've planned to come and see it, they're taken down there and the letters are standing out, and they have the sand in the letters, and it gives it almost looks like a gold lettering effect, and it's really quite moving when they do the sort of presentation of it, and then it washes away in the rain. And I think things like that, I sort of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but that's just a really good example of the sort of thing they do. So they notice they know their audience inside out, but as Oriel says, it's quite different. And other projects we work on, like for example, we've done some work at the National Air and Space Museum in America, and that's a much, I suppose, broader audience, families and things like that. And I think the difference is as well, not only is it the type of visitor and the type of person, but the reason they're visiting and their mentality on the day is almost different. The same visitor to a space museum is going to be a totally different person on the day that they visit a cemetery. So it's almost twofold, really. And I think all you can do is do as much research and ask as many questions as the time allows, really.
And actually, you mentioned something earlier, Paul, a phrase that we often use, again, part of this visitor-focused approach, which is emotional journey mapping. And very often we create what are called emotional journey maps for different profiles of visitors. Now, obviously, you have to be slightly selective in terms of who you focus on, but actually recognising that what, as Paul says, what might be an emotional high for one visitor, might not appeal so much to somebody else. And it's making sure that, again, that translates into physical space, again, arrival in the actual exhibition or core of a site, and then after a visit as well, but really highlighting what are those tangible points, either through content, either through an immersive experience or a very reflective experience with a single object, whatever that might be, really sort of tracking that journey, and then being able to plan it quite deliberately through the design process. So emotional journey mapping, again, a tool that worth looking at and worth applying. Brilliant. Probably time for one or two more questions if anybody has anything. Are there any, if there are any, we will put our details on the chat as well. So if there are any specific questions that anyone would like to ask us offline, obviously happy to do that. So I'll just put my email address in now. Right.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, it looks like that's all the questions, but just to say thanks for the some really nice comments there as well. So
yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, that's great. Well, as I say, more than happy to take any questions personally if anyone wants to email anything through. Really appreciate people listening and having the opportunity to share some of these amazing projects. We feel very honoured to work in some amazing places and with really special clients. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.